Hi, everybody. Welcome to another Certified Fresh event. My name is Sean C. Davis. I am the Developer Experience Engineer over at StackBit, and I'm really excited to be here. I am guest hosting today. Unfortunately, our typical fearless leader, Brian Rinaldi, could not be here. He got pulled away for a talk for Jamstack Berlin at the last minute, and it sounds like it's a super interesting talk. He's focusing on various rendering methods in this decoupled world we find ourselves in. So I'm hoping they record that because that sounds really, really interesting. But we're here, Certified Fresh Events, to talk about serverless functions today. We'll be joined very shortly by Leon Stigter of Lightbend, and I'm really excited for this talk. I've been working with serverless functions for years, and I always assume that they have no state. They're kind of self-encapsulated. So I think Leon's going to bring some really interesting insights and patterns that we can follow. So looking forward to that. Before we dive into that, I have just a few housekeeping items to take care of. So first, thank you very much to our sponsors. Our sponsors are what keep this thing going. If you haven't been around Certified Fresh Events before, this meetup or this community has existed for more than 5 years. So Brian Rinaldi and team have worked really hard over these years to continue to bring these events, but we couldn't continue to do that without the help of our sponsors. And we have 4 today. The first is Stratic. And Stratic is it's a really, really cool service. If you're working with WordPress, so it basically takes a WordPress site and then turns it into a static site, more of like a convert WordPress to Jamstack. I think it's a really, really cool pattern and something you should check out if WordPress is a tool that you work with regularly. Next up is Covery, and Covery is one of these newer tools that I think we're going to see absolutely explode in the next few years. I was thinking recently. I work with a few different AWS services, and I've worked with DigitalOcean over the years. But to really to get an application ready to bundle up, to deploy, to handle and stitch together all these services, it's like a total nightmare to do it on your own. And Covery says you don't have to worry about that. We're going to bundle that all together, and we will handle it. Done. And so check them out if that's in your realm, because that is a super valuable, needed tool in today's landscape. Next is Launch Darkly, and Launch Darkly deals in the space of their bread and butter is dealing with feature flags. And what they wanted to let you know about today is their upcoming conference. It's called Trajectory, and it's going to have a lot to do kind of in that feature flags, but all around the DevOps space. So check that conference out for sure. And actually, I'll pause for a second and say that these events that we do, these Certified Fresh events, they're recurring every couple of weeks. And our upcoming event is actually from someone from Launch Darkly, and we're going to dive deep into feature flags. So if that's of interest, you can come back in a couple of weeks and we'll dig in there. Last sponsor, Netlify. If you've been around this space, around the decoupled world, I'm sure you've heard of Netlify. I love them, been a big fan for years. They totally changed the game in terms of website building for me. And so if you're not familiar with them, give them a look. It'll blow your mind. It's amazing. Okay, that's it for the sponsors. If you have feedback at any time, positive, negative, like, hey, we don't ever want to have this guest host on again, totally fine. Send an email to brian@cfe.dev. That's what continues to keep it's the community that continues to make these events really great. Another thing is that the session is recorded. All of these sessions are recorded. And so if you weren't able to watch live, totally fine. You can come back later. There will be an edited version that gets posted in a couple weeks, but you can always come back to this URL on Crowdcast that you are on right now, and it will have the recorded version of this session. And speaking of that, all these sessions are recorded, and I told you they happen regularly over the course of 5 years. So there are more than 130 talks, sessions, workshops, et cetera, all kinds of great content. And CFE is really focused on like what is happening right now. And so these talks, these topics are really They're really timely, and I feel like I always take something meaningful away from them. And so poke around the cfe.dev website, look at what's been posted in the past. And that's looking past. But if you look towards the future, I would recommend following CFE_dev on Twitter, or also Instagram, and just keep a pulse on what on these upcoming events, because like I said, they always seem to be timely. They're relevant to the way the industry is moving. Absolutely valuable to continue to follow them. And that's it. So before I bring Leon on screen, the last thing I want to mention is somewhere, I think maybe it's below my microphone, there is an ask a question button. So there's the chat on the right side, but you can also click the button to say ask a question. We're going to let Leon go through his presentation, and then I'll disappear while he does that, and then I will pop back up after he's done and facilitate a little bit of Q&A. So any thoughts you have, any questions you have for Leon, hopefully we'll be able to filter those and get those to him after the talk. So with that, I am going to bring Leon on screen. Leon, thank you very much for being with us today. Really appreciate it. Absolutely. All right. So I will get out of the way. I will stop talking now. I will give you the floor and let's bring up your slides. And okay, awesome. It's all you.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So first off, let me start with a good morning, good afternoon, good evening, I guess, depending where you are on the planet. My name's Leon. I work at Lightbend, and over the next 30 minutes or so, I want to take you on a journey as to why serverless really needs a stateful vision. So before that, today actually is really special. We celebrate the indulgence of chocolate, and that actually comes from an Aztec word, which means bitter water. So that's actually pretty awesome. Today also commemorates the first public performance of Charles-Émile Reynaud's Théâtre au Pic. 3 years later, he was totally outshone by the brothers by the Lumiere brothers, which we know from pretty much every other cinema. But today we really celebrate the art form of animation. Total note here, I'm not going to do any animation. I am terrible at drawing. Having said that, it's also really special because today is my first presentation that I get to do for Certified Fresh Events. Longtime listener, first-time caller. So let me start with some mind-blowing numbers to sort of set up the rest of the presentation. In 2018, and that was 3, maybe 4 years ago, depending on when you're watching, IDC predicted that by 2025, the sum of the world's data would hit 175 zettabytes. Even with today's largest SSD on the planet, that's still about 10 billion hard drives. Can you imagine 10 billion hard drives? And 30% of that data is going to be generated and consumed in real time. And if you put that 30% of data on Blu-ray discs, you'd have 8 stacks of Blu-ray discs that would go to the moon and back again. I mean, that is ridiculous when you think about that amount of data. And in the next 3 years, we'll actually create so much more data than we did over the past 3 decades, and we continue to create more data. In fact, in the next 5 years, we'll actually create 3 times more data than we did in the last 5 years. And IoT is like the fastest growing data producing segment there is. And all of that data creation happens at the edge. I mean, edge data creation and edge data consumption is growing as fast as the data creation that happens in the cloud. So we have a lot of data that is being created, being consumed, and being needed, not in the cloud, so somewhere else. Now, that is to sort of set up the rest of the presentation. If you're wondering who your, well, I guess speaker, not entirely host for today is, my name is Stigter, product manager at Lightbend, serverless aficionado, and definitely cheesecake connoisseur, even though I'm pretty much self-proclaimed at that last one. So if you have any recommendations on good cheesecakes, let me know on Twitter. I'm at Rickets. So enough about me. Let's actually go back to our regularly scheduled programming, and let's talk about that awesome data, that incredible amount of data. And every fairy tale, I totally get it, starts in the same way, once upon a time in a land far, far away. And, in all honesty, this is not going to be a fairy tale because you actually want to do something stateful with serverless. And I want to set the stage with a story. So imagine this. You work at the corporate office of a large coffee franchise chain, and that coffee franchise chain is called Acachino. Your business unit, so the team that you work in, is responsible for all of the IT systems and all of the software that all of those franchisees use. But Acachino is special. They've got everything connected to the internet. I mean, you've heard of API first, you've heard of developer first. I mean, there are amazing talks here right on cfe.dev about that. Well, Acachino is special because they are IoT first. Even the napkin dispensers that they have are connected to the internet, so they know when to send in new deliveries of napkins to those coffee shops. And guess what? This is you. You are the engineer. You are one of the engineers on that team that's responsible for all of those backend services. And that actually, all that IT is one of the primary differentiators that your company has over all of those other coffee chains. And so far, your career, the IT systems, everything has been going rather smoothly. And I also want to introduce you very quickly to your manager. I mean, this is the VP of engineering, the principal architect, the director of engineering, however you want to call it. And she needs to execute on the business strategy. I mean, she needs to do it fast, and she needs to do it at large scale because what she does impacts all the stores across the entire world. And this is your dev team. And Acachino is special. We talked about that. They're IoT first. The only thing they didn't really have was a customer loyalty program. So the CEO, they hired a new VP of customer loyalty, and that VP suggests that they're going to launch this completely new loyalty program together with a massive marketing campaign. And without talking to anyone, he promises that that program is going to be live in the next month or so. So massive large-scale rollout that usually happens over the course of a year. Now it needs to happen in just a few weeks. And it's not just the team that's at stake here. It's literally the entire company because they've already started promoting it. So as you try to figure out just how to get that done, you start to realize that there are a bunch of challenges. I mean, you need to ramp up an entire team. This is not something that you've done before. The deadline is June 23rd in this case. So you have only a few weeks to go before you can actually hit that deadline. You need to make sure that you have the right infrastructure. I mean, if you're not on serverless yet, are you going to provision for peak performance, or how are you going to handle that? If you are on serverless, which tools, which technologies are you going to use there? Speaking of technology, you have to decide on the technology that you want to use, because it's not just the application that needs to be built. It needs to be rolled out. It needs to be streamlined. And speaking of rolling out, you need to decide on that entire rollout plan. Together with your VP, you're going to be responsible for making this a success. You are going to be responsible for making sure that Acachino is not only the IoT first coffee shop company, they are the best brand on the planet. So new markets demand new technology. I mean, Acachino's existing customers and the new ones that you are trying to get with, they are very heavily influenced by that loyalty program. This is going to be the perfect storm of almost impossible customer expectations. And those near impossible expectations, they are set by the marketing campaigns that the VP of customer loyalty just created. And those obviously need to be met as quickly as possible. And you're the engineer, so everyone's looking at you to make it work. So you start thinking, why shouldn't we do what we've always done? I mean, as you can see, there is a large stack of servers behind you. So why not use those? Why not use all the things that you've done before? And simply because it's too time consuming. I mean, let's be honest, building a brand new architecture, that takes time. Just look at all the building blocks that are on the screen: databases, event brokers, caches, Kubernetes clusters, ingress routers, load balancers. And I mean, this is just a simple architecture. Things can be not scalable, not elastic enough. And that's obviously not just about the hardware, not just about the machines, because the cloud, and we just talked about some amazing sponsors for CFE, they can do this for you. But it's also finding the new folks, the new team that's going to be managing all of this. And that takes a lot of time. That is time consuming, that is resource intensive, that is difficult to do. And let's be honest, things can be very costly. The hardware, even in the cloud, can be expensive, and that skilled staff that you're going to need to maintain and operate it is not going to be cheap either. A single server is great. I mean, you know, the one that fits like right under your desk. But as you start to scale it, that can become a nightmare. That's going to be one of the most challenging things to do. And ultimately, it could even be too legacy. Let's just focus on this picture for a second. What if you cut corners? What if you like take out the cache because, you know, maybe we don't need that? Or what if we take out the event broker and just let all the applications talk to each other? That's going to be cutting corners, and that means that you and your team are rushing to build things, and those platforms are not necessarily set up for high performance, not necessarily set up for the elasticity of customer demand. So you're going to build a relatively brittle solution. And as you start to cut corners, you're setting yourself up for even more legacy, even more tech debt. And that ultimately means that you and your engineers are going to get burned out. They're going to revolt. They're not going to be happy. They're going to leave. And that's going to leave Acacino with a very bitter taste in their mouth. Coffee, obviously. So you know what? Let's talk about serverless, because what you need in order to make this work is just a bunch of functions, right? That means no infrastructure to do, near infinite scale, pay only for what you use. And literally, it feels like serverless is the best thing to happen to IT since Betty White, which was before the invention of sliced bread. And the thing is that there are tons of questions that you and your customers are going to look for, both internal and external. Questions like, what kind of qualifying transactions have I done as a customer that qualify for any loyalty points? What is the current balance on my loyalty card anyway? And obviously, very important, what can I actually do with those points? And does the store that I actually go to have that special blend of coffee that I actually really like? Do they have that in stock? And that means that a normal stateful approach just isn't going to be sufficient. In this case, the data is literally as important as the business logic. And going to the database for every single question just isn't going to cut it. So that means that the answer is obviously just add more serverless. Perhaps not, because this is where patterns like event sourcing and CQRS, which is command query responsibility separation, and that's because of the length of that name, that's probably why we abbreviated it to 4 letters. But that's where those patterns start to become really important for both the performance as well as the experience that you're going to give your users. So let's pause for a second. Let's think about what event sourcing actually is. So event sourcing essentially means that rather than storing only the current state, so let's say that we're talking about an order, instead of just storing the order that has happened in your database, you're actually storing all events, all the things that happened. So getting back to Acacino, you could be capturing all those qualifying transactions. And if you want to get real fancy, like Acacino likely wants to be, you can actually look at all those individual transactions and capture all the things that were added and removed from an order, so that you could see that this particular special coffee was very frequently added, but also very frequently removed. So maybe there's a problem that you need to address. Maybe it's too expensive. Maybe people didn't really understand what that coffee was. So event sourcing actually gives you amazing insight into everything that happens. Okay, so what about this CQRS thing then? So CQRS, or Command Query Responsibility Segregation, essentially means that you're splitting the reads and writes, or the CUND from the R if you talk about CRUD. So why is this useful? So if you're working with a bunch of developers, a bunch of services on the same set of data, that means that you're going to have a lot of users. That means that in the case of Acachino, you're going to have millions of users on their app, on the website, using the point of sale systems. If they're ordering in person, they're going to make transactions. They're going to add things. They're going to remove things. And that means that your database really needs to scale. So what about accessing data? I mean, you're likely storing all that data in the same table. So everyone could technically read all that data from other users. Now, with CQRS, you're essentially splitting the responsibility for commands and queries. So that essentially means that the one part is all about making updates. It's essentially telling the system that something should happen, like order this coffee. And your business logic would process that. It would create what they call a fact out of it, and that is what you store. Now, the other part is all about reading from it. So you have two very separate pieces, one that creates things and makes sure that the order gets placed, and one that reads things and makes sure that you actually get to see which orders you have. And those can be scaled very independently. So if you all of a sudden get more orders, let's say Black Friday, Cyber Monday, maybe around Christmas, and less people actually looking at the orders that they've made, then you can scale that piece, that command piece, individually from the read side of things. So let's continue. Let's think about for a second, what if everything was completely serverless? What if we had no more servers in our lives like ever? And obviously, as we just talked about, we need to store all of this information somewhere. And luckily, in our industry, we solved that part ages ago, obviously with the invention of the database. So let's hook up functions to a serverless database. And that is essentially going to open up a lot more questions, as we just talked about. As more and more compute starts to move to the edge, I mean, we want the individual stores of Acachino to make decisions. Does that mean that every call really has to go to a central location? Can't we use a cache? If we use a cache, which one do we use, and how is that going to work? Do our engineers really understand how a cache works in serverless? So you know what? Let's actually go do that. And we could even have a local cache at the edge. But all of a sudden, that means that we need to replicate data. We need to make sure that the data in that cache isn't going to be stale, because that's the worst problem that you can have, stale data, especially if your customers, if your functions rely on that data to see if they qualify for promotions, if they have points that they can redeem. And obviously, we also need to make sure that functions can send data to each other. So let's add a serverless event broker. And now everything talks to everything again. So as we move data to the locations where our compute is, we need something extra. And serverless is amazing. And I truly hope that we do more and more serverless, pretty much up until the point that I can honestly say that I only need my iPad to go do things. I mean, that would actually be really cool. And in order to do that, we need something extra, especially as we move to the edge. We need something that gets the right data to the right place for the right amount of time. Because we also need to make sure that in the case of a cache, for example, that it's only living for the duration that we set it. If we think for more amazing use cases, let's say that I want to be able to pay by just looking at a screen, then we kind of want to make sure that the biometric data is only at the edge in that store for the amount of time that I'm there. And that is where stateful serverless comes in. I mean, if you think about stateful, then I totally understand that there is this connotation that serverless can never be stateful. But I do think that as an industry, we really need to think about how can we make that happen? How can we make sure that instead of us going to a database, that we can make sure that the information our functions need can find that function when it needs to be there? so that as developers, we can really focus on code, not on servers. So that as developers, I mean, wouldn't it be great if you could just put your business logic together with your business data and be able to pick a model that is suited for whatever it is that you need to do, so that you can think about the data structure without thinking about how am I going to model this in a database. I mean, what if I want to use things like event sourcing, any of those patterns I talked about? What if I want to use like CRDTs or conflict-free replicated data types to really make sure that all of my stores can communicate with each other and that they make sure that there are no conflicts in there? And wouldn't it be amazing if we could just take a description that says, this is how my API is going to look like, this is all that I want to do with my data, without ever creating a single database? So let me take a second, and I'm going to demo it using one of our products called Akka Serverless, but you could obviously choose whichever product that you desire. So let me stop sharing my slides for a second. And I'm going to go into Visual Studio Code. Thank you, thank you, Sean, for pulling that up. Simply because this is my favorite editor of choice. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create that API description, because everything starts with an API description. So I'm going to do I'm just going to call it value entity.proto, and my value entity is essentially going to be sort of like a key value store. Think of it as like I'm only capturing the latest pieces that are interesting. And in this case, I'm going to do it in a .proto file, which is going to be a protocol buffer, simply because that is an easy way to not only model the API, but also to be able to model the data. So I'm going to start with the syntax proto3. I'm going to add some package statement, simply because it follows a very Java-esque, I would almost say, structure. And then I basically need to add a bunch of messages. And in this case, I decided that just to make it more simple, I'm going to do a hello world message or a hello world service, so that you can sort of see how that works. And in this case, what I'm storing, so rather than me modeling a database, I basically tell, in this case, Akka Serverless, these are the things I want to store. I want to store the name, I want to store the message, and I want to store how many times people have called that specific name. So, and obviously with APIs, I need a request, and that's going to be a name and the actual greeting, and I'm going to need a response because I do want to send something back. So last thing I do is essentially say, okay, this is what needs to happen. And that's all great. I mean, if we look at all those patterns from before, this is just plain old CRUD. I mean, this is basically me saying, okay, I have an API. This is what I'm going to accept. This is what I'm going to send back. And in this case, what is really different from like more traditional databases, this is how I store things. And there is no database involved. If I look at those other patterns, let's say I want to look at something like CQRS, I want to make sure that that I can split the request and response from the actual query side of things. So in this case, let me just think of something. You know what? Maybe I want to have a query that says, give me all the data based on the message that people have passed in. So in the case of hello world, give me all the messages that had hello world instead of something else. So in this case, I can have a second service, and that really is all about just getting me the data. And in this case, because it's a relatively simple thing, I can just put in a true SQL query, basically selecting everything where the message is the message that we put in. So in this case, I've implemented the CQRS pattern in a few lines of API description, let's say 52. And that makes it so much easier for me to go scale things, because I can ultimately scale this part, the actual people putting stuff in, independently from this part where I get data back. And that makes it easy for me to scale. That makes it easy for me to make sure that I get to essentially be the most successful coffee shop, I should say, on the planet. Now, if I want to like fully implement this, let me actually quickly show you. So let's do it with JavaScript, which is one of my favorite languages. So I'm just going to do a value entity.js. Obviously, I need to start with my imports. Then I need to start with creating the what they call entity. So how are we going to store everything? And this is basically tying the JavaScript to the proto file. And then there is this thing called initial state, and that means what am I going to do when there is nothing in the database? Because we're not going really to a database, so we need something that represents an empty row. And then ultimately, it is about the function. So this is just counting the amount of as you can see here, it's counting the amount of invocations of this particular service. And so rather than doing anything with the database, I kept everything in code, everything in configuration. If I deploy this to, in my case, as I said, Akka Serverless, it is going to make sure that it has that nice API endpoint so I can call it. And basically, without ever seeing a database or any of those things, this is the power of serverless, obviously, coming in. I have my complete, in this case, hello world scenario without ever doing something. So it really simplifies a lot of the things that you need to do. You don't have to worry about a lot of the infrastructure, but you at the same time can look at relatively hard problems to solve, like CQRS, like event sourcing, so that you can actually take those very hard distributed data problems and make it a lot simpler, a lot more accessible to developers. So then quickly going back to slides to sort of wrap it up, because I do want to be respectful of everyone's time and really keep it short and sweet. So this is what the team did, and ultimately you got to think about the behavior of your code, and you didn't have to think about hiring new staff, retraining them, because you had all the employees already there. You didn't have to think about servers. You could think about the data, how you structured it. You didn't have to think about databases or any of the other infrastructure. And that ultimately meant that you and the team were able to pull off this incredibly massive rollout. You've made the VP of customer loyalty very happy. You made your VP or your principal architect very happy. All of the customers were happy. Your business grew faster than ever before. You are now the number 1, 2, and 3 coffee chains on the planet. And obviously, for your success, you received the Employee of the Month simply because for Accachino, stateful serverless, being able to do all these things together inside of a coffee store at the edge was literally the answer that they were looking for. Now, if you're curious how that works with Lightbend stuff, go check out Akka Serverless on akkaserverless.com. And honestly, with that, we're pretty much at the end of the presentation. So I really wanted to thank you all for taking the time to listen to me, to look at why stateful serverless is such an important thing, and why I absolutely believe as more data moves towards the edge that we need stateful to be in serverless so that we can make decisions at the right time when the data moves to my service, as opposed to my service having to go collect the data. So let's see if we have any questions. Sean, did you see if we had any?
Yeah, we have a few. First of all, thank you so much, Leon. That was fascinating. I'm like furiously typing down some questions of my own as well. So yeah, we've got a couple of user questions. I want to set them up first, and actually, I want to begin with what I think is the most important question, which is, it's National Chocolate Day, so I went to get chocolate while I was backstage. So where is the best chocolate? Like what is the best chocolate?
Ooh, that's a very, very loaded question. And I actually totally love Belgian chocolate. And maybe it's because I grew up in the Netherlands and we had really easy access to it. But those Belgian bonbons, that like proper Belgian chocolate, amazing. I'd absolutely recommend that any day of the week.
Oh, where do we get that? Can you
Um,
just like
am I
pick it
allowed
up
to
at
name brands here?
any market? Oh, sure. Yeah, why not?
Well, okay, well, I don't know. I mean, so one of the ones I actually really like is a brand called Merci, and you can pick that up at a lot of places, a lot of supermarkets, a lot of grocery stores have them. So you shouldn't have any issue finding that. The other one
Okay.
I totally love, and I think it's Swiss, if I remember correctly, is a Toblerone. And what they do, they have this chocolate and they mix in a bit of nougat. Amazing.
Oh, this is good. Okay, now I need to get more. But first, let's go back to
Yeah,
some questions. Okay, so I have a few user questions. I think one thing that would help maybe frame those is, can we go back to the idea of data storage first? And you
sure.
said you said several times like we're not storing data, but if we're managing several franchises and coffee shops, like they have to have data somewhere. So can you talk a little bit more about that? Like the data has to live somewhere. So what were you really referring to when you're saying, yeah, we're not storing data?
So great question, and maybe I didn't explain that properly. So I do apologize for that. And what it is all about, or at least what I think stateful serverless is all about, is that we don't need to have a single central store where we store all our data. So we don't have to
Mhm.
have one large database where everything goes into. We what we need to get at, as more and more of our compute is literally moving towards more IoT devices, we want to make sure that those devices are capable of making decisions on their own. And in order to do that, we need to make sure that the data actually is moved towards the edge as well. So rather than storing everything in one big central location, what I'm saying is, as we think about stateful serverless, why not move that data to where it actually needs to be so that we can make faster decisions on better data? And ultimately, and this is more true for something like facial recognition than like when you're boarding a plane, for example, than obviously a coffee store. But we also need to think about, can we make sure that the data is only there for the time when it's needed? Because in all honesty, I really don't want my face to be in some system longer than it needs to be. And I'm pretty sure
Mm.
that a lot of people here would agree with me on that one, or at least I hope they do.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. And I think that that's great. It clears it up. That I think that sets the stage. And so I'll lead into a question from Joe, which I think we'll build on that. And what Joe says is, he says Firebase, DynamoDB through Amplify and AppSync and Fauna, that they all do this stateful serverless that you're talking about, and they tend to be really well known. So why not use those, especially because they tend to be very affordable?
Oh, totally. Look, I'm not here trying to sell you a product of Lightbend. I mean, if you do, it will be great. What I'm here is I'm trying to sell you on the idea of doing more stateful serverless. Um, and I just showed it using Lightbend's technology because that's where I work and that's what I'm most familiar with.
Mhm.
But by no means are we the only company on the planet that will be able to do things. If we were, I mean, that would also be super awesome. Don't get me wrong, but in that case, it will be much more a sales pitch on Akka serverless as opposed to being a sales pitch on why I think stateful serverless is so important.
Is there anything in particular that Akka serverless or Lightbend does that might be unique from those other services?
So I do think that the way that we let you model your data as opposed to having to do things in a database is really different. But then again, it is all about, and that's at least one of the things I tried to touch on early on in the presentation. As you got those incredible requirements from the VP of customer loyalty, and you need to think about ramping up the entire team. that's when you need to make a decision on technology. I mean, what team do I have? So ultimately, while I'd love everyone to go check out Akka Serverless, try it out, and obviously give us feedback on what works, what doesn't, the number one thing that I think people have to realize is that you need to pick technology that serves your use case in languages with in ecosystems that fit the team that you have.
Yes,
Love
great.
the question, by the way. Really
Absolutely.
good question.
I do as well, and I think that's great points. So you had that example up there using Akka Serverless, and Jeremy is wondering, is Akka Serverless, or maybe and maybe also expand beyond to serverless? Is it just for JavaScript developers?
So no, not at all. I mean, as I said, I chose JavaScript because I'm familiar with that. I could have done Java, I could have done Scala, I could have done Python. Actually, I couldn't have done Python because I don't write Python very good. But if there was someone that could write Python, they could have chosen Python. So it really all depends on what you're comfortable with. I mean, that sort of touches on the previous question as well. You should choose whatever makes you happy. You should choose the languages that you know, because ultimately, if you need to learn a language, a programming language, just to be able to use a tool, that's not going to end well. You need to choose a tool that supports a programming language that you want it to, or that your team knows really well.
Do so the various tools that we've mentioned, do each of them only support like a certain set of languages?
Yeah, I mean, it obviously depends on which tool you look at. You do see that more and more companies are trying to be, or more and more platforms, I should say, are trying to be language agnostic, and sometimes that just goes better than other times. But ultimately, and I know I've said this before, and I keep coming back to it. You should choose the products that make sense for your use case.
Great.
Obviously, I'd be very happy if you chose Akka Serverless, but
okay, what do we have? Oh, let's see down here. Okay, it says, can I use Akka Serverless for event-driven architecture? Something like that. Like, how can PubSub or gRPC streaming fit working in this type of product?
Sure. So, I mean, if you look at serverless in general, serverless is great for event-driven architectures. I mean, it was one of the, I would almost say, one of the founding principles, because if you are stateless, then inherently everything is going to be an event, simply because you need to be told what to do. With something like Akka Serverless and some of the other products that you mentioned as well, you obviously can change that dynamic a bit more. But the idea of event-driven architecture is still very much at the heart of everything that is serverless. But because you really want to make sure that you only do stuff when something happens, and that was like the fluffiest sentence ever. But it does sort of encapsulate the idea of what event-driven is. I mean, something happens, an event happens, and that triggers an action somewhere. So yeah, totally, you could definitely use Akka Serverless for that.
Actually, okay, so you say you only want to, you only want to run when you want to run, right? Basically, you want to respond to events. Big advantage of serverless. And so early on in the presentation, you mentioned the cost of serverless, and that tends to be a big benefit. And I recall, for me, back in the maybe 3-4 years ago, I was working at an agency, and we were mostly just banging out marketing websites, but at the time moving from the classic monolith approach to this more modern decoupled approach. And one of those primary benefits, aside from like speed, scale, performance, and all that, we talked a lot to clients about cost. We were like, these services are super cheap. It's great. We don't have to maintain load balancers and run this web server 24/7. It's great. And it turned out that for really simple sites, that tended to be the case. But as the sites for the clients who had big sites or big applications, that over time, we found that cost was really just distributed, and the various services still tended to get fairly expensive, even though development costs might have been a little bit less. And so what I was curious of was if serverless, like one of the key benefits, it looks like that it is on the surface looks like it's going to save you a ton of money. But is there anything to be concerned about when you scale? Like any advice in terms of keeping costs low as you scale? Can it get out of hand?
Well, I mean, sure. And anything that you do, well, either in the cloud or on-prem for that matter, can get out of hand cost-wise. I mean, while whether it's ordering hardware and I accidentally typed in an extra zero and ordered 1,000 instead of 100 servers, that's going to be costly. As you move to the cloud, and we've all seen, the Twitter feeds, the Reddit posts, the whatever social media that you like posts about, hey, I saw that my bill this month is just so much more than I expected. That's something that I think we have to look at in a slightly different way as well. Because while I absolutely agree that as an industry, as as vendors of SaaS software, we need to do better at showing cost. We need to be more transparent. We need to make sure that when you scale, either up or down for that matter, that whatever you have to pay is really transparent. But at the same time, people also have to realize that a portion of that cost that you're paying is because you don't need to worry about having a DBA on staff 24/7. You don't have to have an entire SRE ops team that is going to look at that fleet of servers, whether it's the 100 or the 1,000 that I by accident ordered. So there is always going to be a cost difference because people are only looking at it from a pure run point of view. And maybe forgetting about all the other things that I no longer have to worry about.
Yeah, it's very, very fair point. Like not paying as many people in that sense. So,
Exactly.
But and yet it still tends to be a fairly sensitive subject. So do you have any advice
Sure.
for somebody who is tasked with estimating what that cost might look like for the serverless or the functions that they're breaking out as and with the serverless pattern?
So I would absolutely start with looking at the vendors that you might want to evaluate, whether those are like the AWS's, maybe Lightbend, Netlify has like one of the sponsors that you mentioned has an option there. Just look at what they offer in terms of runtime, in terms of memory, in terms of CPU, because that's usually what you're being charged for. And then run a few small tests, and not just like the happy path hello worlds, even though that was obviously my demo, but also making sure that you have some longer running requests, some tests on the skill that you're expecting and maybe a bit more, so that you have somewhat of an insight of what is going to happen. Those numbers, you can relatively easily take to any of those platform vendors and start to calculate. So if I have 10 million invocations and I all of those invocations together use X amount of memory, X amount of CPU, maybe X amount of bandwidth, if that's what you're being charged for, then at the end of the month, that should roughly come down to XYZ amount of dollars. And that's a lot easier to estimate than just doing, I think that I need 128 megabytes and my function is going to run for 2 seconds. And just having some actual real data is going to make that estimation so much more meaningful and so much easier.
I like that. Okay, that's great. Great advice. New question from Adam. Adam asks, what about something like migrations? Can you change the structure of the data after the fact? I think maybe getting at like after you've started running them.
So I think that might actually be more of an Akka serverless question, and I'm more than happy to answer that. And in this case, I do think that whatever technology you end up picking, you should always look at something that supports, being able to change your data. As much as and maybe I'm not the best person simply because I wasn't great at database technology when I was back in university, but I always ended up with having to redo all my schemas and things after the fact, and that was super hard. So whichever technology you end up choosing, of all the things that we've talked about, I would absolutely recommend choosing one where it's super easy to change your data structure. And sure, in Akka serverless, it literally means, if you think about that that description I had 3 fields: name, message, and count. If I wanted to add a new field in that, it literally means that I'll just type whatever field I want. Let's say first, maybe instead of name, I just want to have first name and last name. In that case, I just type them in, and from then on, those fields are going to be available, not just for the stuff that is new coming in, but also for the ones that I already had. So, and that's obviously one of the benefits of Akka serverless, and I'm really happy that the team built it that way. But that's generally something I would always recommend people to look at. How easy is it to, if I want to make a change, how easy can I do that?
Mm-hmm. Okay. I think that is good advice. I've been also bitten by that many times. You want your framework or your tool to be able to adjust, because the project's always going to have changing needs, right?
Okay. I'm also happy to hear I'm not the only one that has experienced that problem.
Right. Yes. Okay, well, this has been great. Let's end on one more question for you, and that is, so I love the conversation today around serverless and considering state and statefulness with tying these serverless functions together. So let's say you've sold somebody and they want to. They've got a more traditional application architectural pattern, and they want to start to break that out into serverless functions. What advice do you have from them on what are the biggest gotchas or the biggest challenges in moving from a traditional application to one that is more segmented or relies on serverless functions?
So I'm going to name a pattern that I think was, or at least maybe has been popularized by Jeremy Daly, who's over at Serverless Inc. now. And he talked about strangling the monolith. And I think that is probably one of the best ways to think about moving to serverless to begin with. Simply because you have something that works, and whether you want to call it legacy or not, I mean, totally depends on you. But you have something that works and you want to start augmenting that. So there is no way that you should throw that away, begin completely anew, because that's going to be an incredibly long, incredibly difficult journey. So what I absolutely recommend as you're moving into serverless is just augment certain parts of it. Let's pick one, maybe 2 parts of that application that you want to scale independently, or that maybe are slightly easier to capture in more function-oriented programming, simply because that is going to give you a better idea of what is coming next. And obviously, if you can do that in a much more stateful way, it also means that you're reducing the load on that monolith, on that existing system. So as you start to think about moving things, it really pays to think about what are the parts that I can do stateless, what are the parts I want to do stateful. Because I'm not saying that one is better than the other. There are definitely use cases for both.
Okay, that's great. One piece at a time, and looking at those, what are you going to get the biggest benefit from,
Sure.
and break those off. Great. Well, thank you very much for being with us, Leon. This was a great talk. Really enjoyed both the talk and the conversation following it. Thank you for everyone for joining us. Just a quick reminder that in 2 weeks there's another CFE event. This one is called Releasing in Secret with Feature Flags. It is going to be from one of our sponsors, Launch Darkly, and that is sure to be a really, really interesting topic. So I hope to see you all back then. And until then, yeah, thanks for being here. We'll see you.
See you.